essentially what I'm trying to do here is build a context, a background as to how the National Seashore started and what was going on in the Cape before it was created. So the first slide is the Glacier. It's all white, cold and blue, and Native Americans living here for 10,000 years. The Cape juts out in the middle of the ocean, and so it's always early explorers and pilgrims stumbling across the native people. Shipwrecks occur here throughout the 1800s especially, but the Cape communities are really prosperous because of whaling and fishing, but that begins to dissipate in the late 1800s. The outer beach is never really fully developed because there's no navigable harbors there. So the Cape's economy kind of crashes by 1900, 1920, and all these Cape towns are shrinking. Like Wellfleet had 3,000, they're down to 700 by 1920. So it's an interesting. By 1920, it was really a backwater, and it was a wilderness area almost on the outer beach. So then through the 30s, America starts to change. Post-World War II, baby boomers, interstate highways, and the gobbling up of coastal land. And by the 50s, there's a famous study that shows only 7% of the eastern Gulf coasts have public access. Certain areas, like Ocean City, Maryland, get totally overdeveloped. I'm just trying to show contrast here, which direction we could have went. Land was still cheap by the 50s, but the population was doubling every 10 years. And so I'm just kind of setting that context. So the next part, talking about the Park Service as an organization, how it's evolved. Teddy Roosevelt just forces parks in places that a lot of people didn't want, like Grand Canyon initially. The Shenandoah example with the mountain families having to leave so they can build this parkway. And even the creation of the Tetons, even Rockefeller wants to donate everything, and the ranchers are like, we don't want a park here. So there was experience through the 50s of places where people didn't want parks. Then you had the 6 staunchly New England towns here, who had their traditional uses, they had their tax base, and they didn't want big government. They didn't want old houses to be just, erased from the landscape. So the traditional uses like off-road vehicles, surf casting, berry picking, shell fishing, the people out here didn't want to lose those because of some kind of new park that wouldn't allow them. So there was concerns about that. And then the old expression, the fear of day trippers. If there was a National Seashore, people would come down with a $5 bill and a clean shirt and never change either one during their trip. That's kind of the old Yankee saying out here. So National Park Service starts to evolve in the 30s. Military sites are added to the service. Up until the 20s, there's only one park east of the Mississippi. Now they wanted to reach more people close to Boston and other urban areas. Cape Hatteras becomes the first National Seashore in 37. Then there's this whole building program in the Park Service from 56 to 66 to modernize the Park Service by its 50th anniversary in 66. So it's called Mission 66. This park is a Mission 66 park. This visitor center that I'm in is a Mission 66 visitor center with lots of glass and modern look to it, because visitation of parks was supposed to go from 4 million before World War II to 100 million by 1966. So then we talk about Saltonstall. Leverett Saltonstall, former governor of Massachusetts, who's now a senator in the late 50s. He's working with the local politicians to try to sell the idea of a national seashore here. There's hearings that are held. Hastings Keith, who's the local congressman, is involved. And there's Leverett again at these public hearings. This one was right down the road in Eastham. People venting, saying, you can't take our homes that were built by 3 generations of our family, and what about tax base, and are you going to just totally be the big gorilla here? And then talking, his criticism, these beaches around here, they're just too dangerous. The outer beach is too dangerous for swimming. It's too cold. So there are a lot of critics saying it's just not going to work. The Park Service doesn't know what it's doing. And other people comparing a proposal out here for a seashore to Nazi Germany in the 30s, saying, here we go. Government's just going to control our lives, take our homes. And so there's a lot of political opposition locally. So finally, there's a lot of compromise, and the final bill pulls together what we call the Cape Cod Model, which was a series of compromises with the communities. The first was, like this old house, that the pre-1959 houses would stay. So they're suspending the power of eminent domain. That's one part of the Cape Cod Model. Second part is to have an advisory commission Here's a view of all the people around the table. These people represent all the 6 towns. They have a direct voice to the superintendent, and they meet 4 to 6 times a year. And that's how the local community can get a direct voice, and they make recommendations only to the superintendent. And they've recommended from every issue, from off-road vehicles to jet skis to dune shacks. They've been active ever since. First advisory commission in the Park Service. And then there's other national seashores that come right after us that are using parts of the Cape Cod model to fit, like Fire Island and Point Reyes and Gulf Islands and Padre Island. These are all national seashores that come a little later. So Kennedy signs the bill August 7th, 61. He's all excited because although he wasn't intimately familiar with the Outer Cape, he was more familiar with this Hyannisport place. He knew the importance of the Outer Cape for the American people and how close it was to the Boston, Providence, New York area. So I compare the Cape Cod model, all those things we just talked about, to the posts and beam of a barn. It held up the structure of the park while we worked out all the little minor issues like the off-road vehicles, where you could drive, the nude sunbathers, where they could go if they were allowed at all. And then over the years, the Seashore has evolved. Now we focus more on preserving old buildings like this Old Harbor Life-Saving Station, which was restored. And now we also have work with partners more than we used to do back in the early days. So John Thomas, who's a local advocate for park uses in Provincetown, he's always kind of the watchdog for what we're allowing. Are the traditional uses still being allowed? Or is the Park Service being too stringent? Are we kind of evolving away from those promises we made? We have longtime retired employees who still live in the area, like Fred Richardson. He worked here at the Salt Pond Visitor Center for a couple of decades, still lives in the area. We still utilize his knowledge and tap into him. And then there's people who actually help take care of the Nauset Light Keeper's House, which is next to the Nauset Light. That's Tim Dobbinspec, and he's got a special use permit to use the house, and he maintains it. So we have all these partners now, whereas early years the Park Service was trying to do everything themselves internally. And the old saying is that the ultimate compliment is to have an old-time Cape Codder come up to us and say, and whisper to us and say, "Thank God for the National Seashore."